So, for the longest time, a lot of people have been asking me about how I use color in my paintings. So, I thought I'd make a video talking about some of the things I personally think about when I'm working with colors. I don't plan on going into too much detail about color theory or other complicated topics because I don't want to get super technical in this video, but I do want to share a lot of the common things I do in my art to create vibrancy and visually interesting color in my paintings. And just in case it needs mentioning, when coming up with the tips in this video, I mainly had digital art in mind, but hopefully there's something of use in here for non-digital artists. There might be some overlap between what I talk about in this video and what I've already covered in my 7 lighting techniques video, so if you haven't already, I recommend watching that one as well, since lighting and color go hand in hand. So with that being said, these are 6 of the coloring techniques that I use in my paintings. Ironically, the first tip I have about color is that there's actually something more important than color when painting, at least for me, and I'd say that that's value. In case you don't know what that is, when we refer to value, we're referring to how light or dark a color is. Having a good value balance in your painting will create more depth and contrast. It's important to create a good balance of light and dark values while painting because this is a crucial aspect in creating dynamism in a finished work. The reason I place value at a higher importance than color alone is because what I discovered for at least my style is that I can actually use whatever color I want with the confidence that it'll work just by having good values to start. And this is why in a lot of my paintings, I like to see how far I can push the use of various colors. And one reason why I can comfortably do this is because I'm conscious of the value of the colors I'm using and the overall balance of lights and darks on the canvas. So for most cases, remember that value trumps color in terms of importance in making a convincing painting. So now that I've said all this, what are some ways you can keep value in mind while painting? I think the first thing to do that helped me with getting better at values was practicing without color first. You can start off practicing values by doing lots of grayscale studies of photos or other art. And doing grayscale studies helps you pay attention to the contrast between light and dark areas of a painting, which will then help you a lot when you decide to use color. Another thing I keep in mind is the fact that value affects how a certain color reads depending on the context you use it. For example, these 3 colors here are all yellow, but their different values changes how they're perceived. In addition, the lightest of these 3 looks pale when placed in front of a lighter background, yet vibrant when placed in front of a dark one. If you wanted to paint a scene where you have a bright light shining on an object, then it would be important to make sure that you choose the correct value for both the light and the environment or background of the subject to avoid creating a scenario where you use colors that are too close in value next to each other. Something I always do to make sure the value range throughout my painting isn't too narrow is literally just slightly adjusting the brightness and contrast while I develop the painting when I start to feel that things are looking a little too flat. This is an easy way to create a wider value range in your painting, and as you improve your ability to manage values, you'll begin to notice that you actually have a lot more freedom with colors because a good balance of values will hold things together and keep the painting looking convincing despite the colors you choose. Also, I think that using values wisely will actually help you better apply some of the other tips in this video. Something I almost always do in my paintings is practicing this idea of building up colors in layers gradually instead of directly coloring the different areas of a painting a set color. After I make an initial sketch or guide, I usually start by creating a layer of color beneath the sketch to act as the foundational colors I want the painting to have. I'd say this is sort of like toning or staining your canvas in oil painting. The colors I choose at this stage are usually ones that I either want to dominate the image or still show through when I finish the painting, even if I've painted other layers of colors on top of it. So if I want the painting to have blue undertones, for example, then I'll paint under my sketch layer various shades of blue. One important thing to remember about creating a base color is that I often avoid making the base color exactly what you'd otherwise expect it to be. So for example, when I'm painting skin, instead of painting in a skin tone for the base color, I instead pick a color that I think would better fit the environment of the subject, and then layer slightly more appropriate skin tones on top of this color-rich base as I develop the painting further. I also take this layering process as an opportunity to pull out areas of contrast with the additional hues I introduce, while keeping in mind what I mentioned earlier about value. By layering different colors on top of a base, you can decide how subtly you want this base color to show through in the final painting. And this can also create more hue variation in a given area, which is what I'll go into more detail about in the next tip. I think you can make your use of color in your paintings a lot more interesting by practicing using hue variation. And this is essentially the use of different colors within the same area instead of one solid color. This creates more visual interest and makes your subject fit better into the environment it's in. I usually incorporate hue variation in my paintings by constantly slightly shifting the color I'm using around the color wheel. For the way I approach it, hue variation is all about increasing the balance of cool and warm colors in an area, or using groups of like hues instead of one solid hue. This can look like using purple, greens, and blues in skin tones to create areas of contrast instead of the colors you would typically use to represent this. These aren't colors that would naturally show up in skin, but I'm taking the opportunity while I build up layers of color, like in the previous tip, to create more motion in the colors. I'm usually thinking about how I want to vary the tone of a certain area, and I experiment with adjacent colors as well as complementary colors to do this. The whole point is to avoid only using one color for the thing you're painting. Now, when it comes to using hue variation, being subtle with your use of it is probably safer and more encouraged, but since in this video I'm explaining ways that I use colors, there are many times where I totally disregard this caution and push hue variation to the extreme. I recommend trying to incorporate hue variation in your paintings in both subtle and not so subtle ways, and see how you prefer to use it. I like to look at this tip as merely another way to make the colors in your paintings more advanced and sophisticated that doesn't need to be strictly followed in any way, but I definitely suggest thinking about it while painting. I think another way to create more interesting colors in your artwork is by taking advantage of layer blending modes. This is something I recommend to everyone who might not be doing this already. I actually explained this tip in more detail in my video about lighting techniques, but I'll address it here again since it's still relevant. So in case you don't know, blending modes are settings that you can apply to a layer that changes the way it interacts with the layers beneath it. There are a couple of layer blending modes that, when you use them, they affect the combined colors in such a way that you can't easily do by hand. The way I use them is when there's an area of my painting that I feel I want to enhance the colors in somehow. I create a new layer above the one I'm working on. I choose a saturated color, and then I select a mode that I feel looks best for that scenario. Every software has slightly different blending modes, but I want to mention a few of the ones I commonly use in Clip Studio Paint. The two blending modes I use the most are Glow Dodge and Add Glow. I often use either of these two to paint colorful, glowing light or particle effects. It's also good to create sheen on hair or other shiny surfaces if you use it with an airbrush. And two other great settings for the opposite effect are Multiply and Linear Burn. I like to use either one of these when I feel that I want to make a certain area darker while still creating rich, complex colors in the area I want to darken. I can also use this over areas that need to be darkened that already have a certain texture that I want to keep. You can't really replicate this effect manually, so I always resort to one of these two in this situation. The last one I'd say I somewhat commonly use is the color mode. The best way I can describe the way I use this blending mode is when there's an area that I want to change the color of without having to repaint or paint over that area. It's also good for unifying the color of an area while maintaining the values if you run into a situation where you might need to do that. It basically just changes the colors but keeps the values the same. So try out all of the blending modes your program offers to see which ones give you the best effect for the area you want to change. So that way you'll become more familiar with these settings and you'll be more inclined to use them in different ways. The only thing to keep in mind is that the reason we're using these blending modes is to create rich colors. So try not to use anything in between black or white, since you actually get the most out of using these blending modes by using them with colors. So using colors instead of shades allows for color mixing or blending to take place on the layers beneath the blending mode layer in different ways, as the name would suggest. Along with managing values, something that I also think is important for creating paintings that display a good sense of color is being able to manage the saturation of the colors you use, as well as the saturation of your painting as a whole. One thing that might hold you back in creating vibrant paintings is not knowing the importance of saturation or how it affects your perception of a color. And as I've witnessed many times myself, more often than not, an artwork that has both poor or little usage of saturation and a narrow value range will tend to look dull and lifeless. So, briefly, before I continue, saturation refers to the intensity of a color, or how close or far away a color is from gray. So a highly saturated color is very far from gray, and inversely, a color with low saturation is very close to gray. When I'm painting, these are things that I'm thinking about in the back of my mind for every color I choose. Managing the saturation of the colors you use comes down to thinking about how saturated the color you select is in comparison to the other colors you already have on your canvas. So I'd say a good way to get started with managing your saturation is by keeping the first colors you use at about 50% brightness and 50% saturation, or in other words, around the middle of the color wheel in terms of brightness and saturation. The reason I do this is that it gives me the option to push the saturation further as I develop the painting. Similar to the tip where I talk about building up color in layers, you can take that same principle and apply it to saturation. I usually start in the middle of the color wheel and build up more saturated colors as I progress in the painting. Starting around the 50% mark can also let you do the opposite, which is backtrack and bring the color closer to gray, but this isn't really something I do too often. I think it's worth reiterating though that no matter how perfectly you choose the right saturation for your colors, it's still more important to make sure that they have the right values as well. This is why it's possible to make a painting that uses dull, low saturated colors still work fine if the values of those colors have enough contrast. It's also important to manage the saturation for your painting as a whole. Think about how the saturation of the various colors in your painting affect one another when they're juxtaposed. To use this painting as an example, something I did while working on it was making the majority of the colors dull, but creating a point of contrast and visual interest by making the lips more saturated than any other part of the painting. So this is one technique you can use if you feel you don't want to make a painting very saturated, but you still want to have an area that pops. As I mentioned in the tip about value, you can also use contrast and brightness sliders to slightly boost the saturation and contrast of your painting. And this is a quick, easy fix for when you feel that your painting is looking a little desaturated or needs a bit more warmth. Just make sure to only use it subtly because it is easy to overdo it. I think out of all of these tips, this is the one I'm asked about the most, and I don't always have a straightforward answer. The thing about colors is that they're super subjective. As I mentioned earlier, there are other elements to painting that are more important than the specific colors you decide to choose for your artwork. And when I'm painting, the decision to pick one color over another usually has very little reasoning behind it, and it's almost entirely intuitive. But I can try to describe some of my thoughts when choosing colors. So when I select a color, something that I feel I'm always thinking about subconsciously is how one color relates to the next. This encompasses a lot of things, such as whether the color I choose is analogous or complementary to the other colors in the area I'm working on, or what the level of saturation and value of a color is in comparison to what's on the canvas. Basically, I'm always being conscious of every color I put on the canvas, and I try not to be afraid to try something unexpected just to see if it works. Another thing is that I tend to avoid shading or making shadows using grays anywhere I can. Even if something has a local color that's supposed to be gray, I still use a variety of colors that are very low in saturation to avoid creating areas that will wash out the painting or conflict with the more colorful areas in a way that I don't intend. And lastly, I think one of the largest practices I began doing that I feel greatly increased my confidence and ability with colors was experimentation. I'm sure that the act of messing around and seeing what extreme color scenarios I can get away with contributed a lot towards my improvement in this area. I suggest being more daring and confident with your color choices, because you'll begin to learn a lot of subtle things that I can't really express in a video. So just push the limits to see what happens, and you'll realize that you might be able to make colors work for your paintings in ways that you wouldn't have expected otherwise. So that's pretty much all of the tips I've prepared for this video. This might not be the last video I do on this topic of color, so if I come up with more tips in the future, and if there's enough demand, then I'll definitely do a part 2 of this video. But I might need some help though. So if you have any additional questions regarding color, definitely let me know in the comments. I'm always looking forward to reading them. And this video took a lot of work and planning to put together, so I hope this was helpful, and I'd really appreciate it if you left a like on the video if it was. And also, I just want to mention that we're almost at 1,000 subscribers, and I have something planned for when that happens, but I can't do it until we reach that, so please subscribe. It would help a lot. And as always, don't forget to join our Discord server if you want to talk to me and help me grow this community. The link is in the description. Okay, that's pretty much all I have to say. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.